Hello and welcome to another round of interviews here on The Real News. I'm your host, Aman Azhar. And our focus today is Amazon rainforest as a shared resource of the entire planet and all of its people beyond national borders, and how the mismanagement of the Amazon impacts all of us and why we should care. And to help us understand what the situation is in the Peruvian part of the Amazon rainforest, we are fortunate enough to have Berlin Decays with us today. He's an indigenous leader from the people of Peruvian Amazon and currently serving as president of the Regional Amazonian Organization, representing 15 different indigenous people. We also have with us Mr. Andrew Miller, the advocacy director of the Amazon Watch, to assist with translation and to make this interview possible. So thank you to both of you gentlemen for making this time available to us. Now, coming to Berlin, I understand that you are just recovering from COVID-19 yourself, and I'm wondering, how did you contract the disease when a lot of native people are supposed to be in isolation deep in the forest?
First of all, we would like to thank you for this very important interview. It's very important for people to be able to understand what's happening to indigenous peoples in the Amazon. My name is Berlin Diques. I'm from the Ashanika people, indigenous people, but I'm more well known by my Ashanika name, which is Hiribati. And in terms of the COVID-19 is something that is having tremendous effects on indigenous communities in the Amazon, in part because we don't just have to exist in our communities, but also there are certain things that we need in order for daily life. And so there are certain things, for example, salt is an important ingredient in the general food preparation that we're carrying out. And so in many cases, people essentially have to go from some of the communities and travel into the cities. And so that's where they're coming into contact with people who are in the cities and the urban areas. In my case, I'm an indigenous leader from the Ashanika people and also with the organization Orpio. And so there are different activities that I have to carry out in the city. And in recent months, for example, I've been carrying out, among other activities, some attending to a series of situations around the killing of a Kakataibo leader. And in particular, I think that in the process of dealing with his cadaver, that might have been the circumstance in which I contacted COVID-19.
Right. Could you please tell us a little bit about what is the situation on the ground across different native tribes with regards to the COVID-19, and how are you taking care of the healthcare and livelihood? Is government helping to the extent that you need it?
Yeah, so it's a very tragic situation that the indigenous peoples are facing in the country right now. And I say that the COVID-19 is just kind of taking over, is just wiping out everything in its path, in part because COVID-19 doesn't respond to different groups. It doesn't just affect this group and not that group. It doesn't really respond to any of that. It's affecting everybody. And COVID-19 has arrived in some of the most remote parts of the Amazon. And, you know, speaking about more specific situations, really in the month of May was when we really started to see a lot of impacts in the health of different peoples. And one of the indigenous peoples, the most affected indigenous peoples in the Peruvian Amazon, has been the Shipibo people. And, you know, they have been suffering many sicknesses and many deaths. And what this has really done has been, the whole situation has provided for sort of the unmasking of the way in which the inoperability, the inefficiency, the corruption within the government, and not just the current government, but also past governments, in which, you know, there's really kind of marginalization and discrimination and the exclusion of indigenous peoples. And these governments have not been taking indigenous peoples into account in the broader policy discussions. And yeah, we don't appear in that agenda, the national agenda. And so yeah, we've been seeing essentially these huge gaps in terms of the healthcare that indigenous peoples are receiving. Within the region of Ucayali, there's roughly 20 different indigenous peoples that exist, and some 15 of them are represented in organizations under ORAU, the organization that Berlin represents. And yeah, we've just seen this complete inefficiency, inoperability in health. There are very few health posts that are found around the region, and the posts that exist do not receive the resources that they need. They do not have the medicine, they do not have the doctors. And so we've been just doing our best to try to respond to this using traditional knowledge, using different kinds of plants and traditional medicines that we have access to in order to try to minimize the advance of COVID-19 into our communities. But again, this is something that has been a structural problem for governments for a very long time, and they've essentially excluded and discriminated against indigenous peoples going back many decades.
So it is my understanding that you recently met with the Peruvian president along with several other indigenous leaders, and you had the chance to speak with him directly. What did you tell him, and what did he say to you with regards to this situation?
Really, the visit was a function of so much pressure and advocacy that was done for several months, actually. And that was by different kinds of direct letters to the authorities, public statements, guest opinion op-eds, and really calling for the government to pay attention to indigenous peoples. Because we were seeing the deaths day after day, and not just indigenous peoples, but many other folks too. And for a long time, there was no response on the part of the government. So we kept up the pressure, the constant campaigning, and we were pressuring Congress people, we were pressuring the different ministers, and up to the president. So yeah, roughly 1 week ago, finally the president came to Pucallpa, and we had just a few minutes to be able to address him and to underscore our demands. And the key demand was really for financial resources to arrive within the regional governments around the Amazon, and for those governments in turn to attend to the indigenous communities that are being affected by COVID-19. And when we say attend, I mean, it's basic things. It's to have doctors, to have medicine, and for them to resource those health centers around the region that have not received a lot of attention and resources. The president listened to us, and we really feel like they have to start attending to these demands. We don't want more meetings. Action has to happen right now because people are dying. Prior to this, the government had committed to 88 million soles for indigenous peoples, supposedly across the Amazon. But of course, the Amazon is enormous. And those 88 million soles, which is maybe $20 million, would need to be distributed among the different regions. And so roughly 11 million soles had been designated for our region of Ucayali. But that's nothing really. It's very little funding because there's thousands of people in our region that are at risk and need to be attended to. And frankly, that amount of money is not going to be sufficient. And so what we've been doing is we've been identifying certain priority uh, areas and priority communities where those resources need to go. And so the funds should be directed there. And, you know, hopefully the funds going there will help minimize the deaths. You know, so we do believe that the president heard us, but now really the question is the actual assignment of those funds and the distribution of those funds. And we are definitely, as Indigenous federations, we are going to be following up on this. We are going to be monitoring, and we are going to be vigilant about the use of those funds to make sure that they actually arrive in those priority communities and actually help people who are in need.
You were talking about the money and the distribution across the Amazon tribes. It's my understanding that Amazon provides a lot of oil extraction to Peruvian government. Don't they pay native tribes for what they take away from the Amazon?
Para muchas personas y para el mismo estado, so yeah, there are a lot of people and governments and companies, whether they're public companies or private companies, that look at the Amazon as a source of natural richness. But the reality is, as much because of the current situation with COVID-19 as the historic situation, you know, there isn't a benefit for Indigenous peoples in terms of the extraction that happens in our territory. You know, we don't receive any sort of like a financial benefit. We don't receive any sort of royalty payments for the extraction. And in fact, what we're seeing right now is that the Peruvian government is talking about launching an economic reactivation of the country because, you know, there's been a shutdown because of COVID-19. And, you know, from our perspective, that is not favorable to Indigenous peoples. And, you know, if you look at the different industries, if you look at the oil industry and the extraction of oil from our territories, we don't receive a benefit. If you look at mining, it's the same kind of situation. And then also, a lot of communities are affected by the forestry industry, the logging industry that's operating in many parts of the Amazon. And, you know, simply there's no benefit for Indigenous peoples. You know, these industries don't provide us benefits.
Let me also ask, a very important bill is going to vote this week to deny oil industry some of the untouched parts of the forest. And I believe that Indigenous people have lobbied for this as well. How hopeful are you that you'll be able to keep these parts of the forest away from the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, so, you know, the few and far between successes and victories that Indigenous peoples have had, whether that's for their territories or recognition of our collective rights, have always been through struggle. And not just currently, but for many, many years. And in fact, you know, like we stand on the shoulders of the many leaders through the years who have fought and struggled. And that's really like the best legacy that we can leave as leaders, is that people will continue to be able to struggle. And the current sort of law that's been proposed, or it's actually a modification of a law, would be to protect some of the most vulnerable Indigenous peoples. And that's really one of the biggest concerns that Indigenous leaders have right now, is to make sure that this lay is approved and moves forward, because the uncontacted Indigenous peoples are some of the most vulnerable out of all of the communities. And in our region of Ucayali, we have 5 different corridors, territorial corridors, where we find some of these brothers and sisters, uncontacted Indigenous peoples, or sometimes they say living in voluntary isolation. And we believe that if this COVID-19 pandemic, if just one person makes it to their territories and is infected and begins to infect them, then we could easily see the entire just extermination of groups of people, of indigenous peoples who are so vulnerable. And this is something that we want to avoid at all costs. And so, these are people who, for thousands of years, have been living and protecting these parts of the Amazon. But at the same time, it's the Peruvian government that doesn't really recognize these people in many cases. It doesn't, bring them to the fore. And, frankly, even though they're uncontacted, they're still citizens. They're the same citizens of the Peruvian government, and they have all of the rights of everyone else.
And are you getting enough international support or through the solidarity networks to give you the kind of support that you need in doing this?
Para precisar exactamente, nosotros en este momento, las organizaciones in terms of the broader situation with COVID, there's been some support from different allies, but it's, it's kind of like, it's basically small support that we receive from different kinds of allies, nationally and international, and we appreciate that. From the state, though, we've basically gotten no support. And so, it is important that we recognize the help that we've gotten from different groups and who've contributed their, grain of sand. And then we, in turn, have done our best to bring those minimal resources to the communities, to do our best to minimize the advance of COVID-19 and to minimize the gravity of the situation. But, it is important to recognize that we do call on people to provide different kinds of support. We need to pool our resources. And, from our perspective, any kind of support or strategies that are really in favor of the people we receive with open arms.
Towards the end, I cannot help but ask that in your own knowledge and understanding, what do you think is happening to the world today, to the planet, through a series of tragedies, including the COVID? And do you think that people like us in the cities can learn from your way of life?
So thinking about the situation, which is really affecting everyone in the whole world, my personal perception is that a lot of these problems are problems that are created by humans. We're creating the problems ourselves. And, in part because we are not taking care of Mother Nature. We are not taking care of our forests. And we have a situation where, as I was talking about earlier, these massive multinational corporations are coming into the Amazon and are simply seeing the Amazon as a source, as a bank for different kinds of natural richness that they can then extract from and benefit from. And, in a lot of cases, the world does not recognize the existence of indigenous peoples. And the fact that for so long, we have been the ones who've been helping to maintain a certain level of equilibrium between humans and the natural world. And we believe that, if the world doesn't recognize indigenous peoples and doesn't start to adopt some of the worldviews that we have, we believe that the world could be, could bring itself into extermination, essentially. But indigenous peoples do have a lot to contribute in terms of our traditional knowledge systems and traditional medicine systems, and we have a lot to contribute in this regard. So, for example, in response to COVID-19 here in my region, we created these different groups of indigenous youth and that have been formed and have been operating to try to respond and again to minimize the advance of COVID. And they've been using different kinds of traditional plants, medicinal plants, seeds, different kinds of roots that we use. And they've, and in some cases that's administered through a tea or some sort of like evaporization. But, so for example, the matiko plant is one that we've been using and have been offering to different people. And folks, for example, who've have been short of breath and have needed oxygen, but in many cases don't have access to, you know, oxygen because it's not being produced or it's too expensive. And so people have been taking some of these traditional medicines, and that's been helping out. So, you know, overall, I do believe that Indigenous peoples can make a contribution with our traditional knowledge, and then that can be combined with modern medicine, and putting those two things together, that can make a big contribution.
Thank you so much for kind of making us aware of what's going on. This actually brings us to the end of this conversation. So thank you once more, Berlin, for making us aware of what's going on in the Amazon and its native tribes. We wish you the very best of health.
Gracias a ti.
Yeah, so he was just, you know, thanking us for the opportunity to be able to have this discussion and this interview, and he hopes it's not the last time, and he's really hoping, you know, he appreciates the collaboration, which is important for, you know, in benefit of the communities that are very much affected by what's happening right now. And he also wishes that the spirit goes with us to the Indigenous spirit, and, you know, from the Ashanika people, from other Indigenous peoples, that you know, continues to strengthen us in this broader effort. And he also wanted to this is his daughter. He wanted to present his daughter too, who was really interested to kind of like see us also. So that's why she's joining us right now, to kind of to get a sense of us on this side too.
Thank you so much. We'll make sure that we continue with this conversation. And let me also thanks to you, Andrew, for making this very important conversation possible today.
My pleasure, certainly.
And thanks also to our audiences for tuning in and joining us for this conversation. You can always look us up at therealnews.com. For myself and the rest of the team for now, it's goodbye to you and be well.